G'day and welcome to Pellowe Talk Live, Tuesday night show. It's not Q&A. Make sure you use hashtag not Q&A when you invite your friends and say there is a non-taxpayer subsidised alternative to the lamestream attempt. And on this show, we actually admit our worldviews and biases. I'm a conservative and that's where I'm coming from. So take that into consideration as I say everything. But we do want to be held accountable for facts. We want to pursue truth together. If I'm wrong, the greatest kindness you can show me is to relieve me of that ignorance, and I'll return the favor. So tonight I've got a couple of great guests on, and we're going to get into some of the heavy topics going around right now, especially level 4 lockdown in Victoria, why we're not allowed to say hydroxychloroquine on Facebook or YouTube or Twitter or anywhere else, or risk absolute censorship no matter what we're saying in whatever context. However, first, I want to have a chat about why we're quarantining healthy people. Healthy Australians have been forced into various stages of lockdown since the 21st of March. That's now 4.5 months ago. At no stage did we ever think lockdown was a sustainable measure. We were told we only had to flatten the curve. We were told the goal was to prevent overwhelming the health system, to save lives. When we did flatten the curve, when we had less than 100 deaths in 25 million people and nearly no one left in ICU, we were told we now had to have 0 new cases for X number of days. Then, preceded by bureaucratic incompetence, the nevertheless inevitable second wave hit Victoria harder than the first, as predicted. This virus is here to stay, and it always was. And we are still, by Einstein's definition, repeating actions expecting different outcomes, insanely choosing unsustainable public responses. The Prime Minister, state premiers, and territory chief ministers have all dutifully droned on and on about following the advice of politically appointed medical experts, as if they are absolved of responsibility for the consequences of decisions they subsequently make. The restrictions have been utterly absurd in their excess and their enforcement heavy-handed. The expert medical advice has been commonly inconsistent between various chief medical officers, suggesting not a basis in evidence or science, but a basis in subjective political opinions. The Queensland Chief Medical Officer explained there was no scientific or medical basis for shutting down schools and causing massive social burdens to families ill-equipped with time or resources for homeschooling. Never mind the human cost to children caused by months of gaps in school attendance. She believed it was important to send a strong message to the community that the virus should be taken seriously. That is a political decision. The same with the military flyover on Anzac Day. No scientific basis, but a desire to send a subliminal political message to not go for a non-essential drive in your car. Now, many people believe golf is a great way to ruin a good walk, including the Victorian Chief Medical Officer. When asked why he decided to allow walking but not golf, putting 6,900 golf course employees out of work, he didn't point to the science. He admitted there was, quote, some arbitrariness, end quote, in the decisions he made. Likewise, the science revealed the latest virus to escape an embarrassingly insecure Chinese laboratory has a half-life of just 90 seconds in direct sunlight, with moderate temperature, 21 to 24 degrees Celsius, and humidity, 20% humidity. But political elites and an incurious media poured scorn on people who went to the beach in numbers or read a book by themselves on a park bench in direct sunlight. Why? Because experts. Jane Caro pointed out some governments can weigh advice from a wide range of experts and not slavishly agree the fate of the entire world hangs in the balance of doing exactly what cherry-picked experts say when they say. I agreed, offering the inconvenient example of the science of when every human life begins. Politicians are highly capable of ignoring such actually indisputable science when it suits their careers. Now, please don't misunderstand me. It's not long into making a case like this that the people disagreeing with me will jump to conclusions and assume two things that they shouldn't. that I dismiss experts and don't care about people dying. Such assumptions only make a donkey out of those making them and are not based in reality. I highly value the experts, and it would appear I value experts more than the governments making these decisions or their so-called oppositions meekly complying at a time when critical decisions need more transparency, scrutiny, and accountability than ever from our parliaments. I also learned to read, so I could be informed by all the experts and think for myself, a kind of vaccination against narratives approved and disseminated by the Ministry of Truth. It's one of the reasons we send kids to school, or so I thought. Debating is not evidence of callousness, but concern. A government that so disdains the intelligence and character of its citizens that it cannot trust them to make good decisions is itself not to be trusted to make good decisions, drawing its members from the same population of citizens. With this marvelous power called literacy and numeracy, I and many others have weighed the advice of more experts, in addition to those anointed by governments to bestow advice upon their grateful subjects, and reached different conclusions about the human cost of various courses of action. Epidemiological modelling is notoriously unreliable and prone to terrifying exaggeration, yet based only on models proven to be severely flawed and not fit for purpose, governments around Australia overreacted. They pointed to and were comforted only by the thought that everyone else in the world was doing the same thing. That reminds me of what my mum said about friends jumping off a cliff. Don't follow them. Our governments consulted no other experts, or if they did, paid them no regard. Politicians insisted on referring to speculative modelling as science, and mainstream media impotently regurgitated this facile rhetoric with religious devotion. But within a month, it was obvious from hard data that the mortality rate was nowhere near as bad as at first feared. In fact, for those under 60, fit and healthy, mortality is still proven to be no worse than the seasonal flu. Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews insists this virus doesn't discriminate. Yet, with or without ham-fisted lockdowns, 19 out of 20 deaths have been over 60 years old. Mostly the very old already with serious underlying conditions. It was a mistake to quarantine the healthy and only half-heartedly quarantine the sick. Those with eyes to see could see this by mid-April. Yet governments don't like to admit they got it quite wrong and should now take a different approach. That kind of admission could cost government and precious political careers. Normally honest people were now heavily invested in counting cases and infection rates among healthy people at little to no risk instead of the actually important measurements, mortality rates and available ICU beds. One problem with sensational daily reporting of identified new cases is how vastly underestimated the actual number of cases is, care of asymptomatic, untested and undiagnosed infections. The New South Wales Chief Health Officer recently said tests of blood samples for antibody markers have indicated between 250,000 and 500,000 Australians may have already been infected with COVID-19. The fatality rate from the seasonal flu is typically around 0.1% in the US. With just 221 deaths to date, Australia's COVID fatality rate is only 0.09% at worst, maybe just 0.05% here in Australia, compared to 0.1% on average from the flu in America. So, are sustained and socially devastating government restrictions really justified? How many lives should be cavalierly risked and lost to save 1,000 from the China flu? On the balance of advice from both highly reputed medical and economic experts, the most restrictions justified by hard data and actual science was robust enforcement of a strict quarantine and monitoring for those actually infected or awaiting test results, physical isolation of those at high risk, over 60 years old and or with comorbidities, and cared for by people with strict personal protective equipment, PPE protocols, rigorous personal hygiene and physical distancing etiquette for everyone else. Now, complaints about the details of these standards, and I've got them, miss the point. We've been isolating everyone for 4.5 months. And anything less is not something to complain about unless you're offering even less restrictions, which I would happily consider the merits of. But I've been challenged on my logic in this debate with shallow emotional manipulation, arguing for total lockdown of healthy, asymptomatic people. For example, it's not my responsibility if the guy who takes my money at the pizza shop gets the virus from me, goes home to his wife with a respiratory condition, and she dies alone on a ventilator. Why should everyone be locked down and isolated instead of just her, or even both of them? Why wasn't he working out the back in a controlled environment and PPE instead of handling cash and interacting with the public? If her risk was so high, why wasn't she better controlling her environment? Instead, such arguments propose we hold an entire nation of people hostage in their homes, so people with higher morbidity risk can be protected from life and all its inherent risks, as if they would have more freedom under that scenario. I get it. No one wants to die and no one wants to be locked down in their homes. But everyone's suffering doesn't ease anyone's suffering. It multiplies suffering and reduces the nation's ability to care for those suffering long term, multiplying further suffering. If the choice is between locking down those over 60 or everyone, those over 60 get the same result either way. But if we let the vast majority of the workforce get back to it and life as normal, except for interactions with those people in high-risk categories, then the social safety net they need to survive lockdown or infection will itself be maintained. What's good for the health system is good for the original objectives, preventing deaths and preventing overwhelming the health system. If I may turn a terrible accusation back on those who suggest dissent from the official dogma equates to wanting people dead, where is their concern for the deaths caused by the quarantine of millions of otherwise healthy or asymptomatic people? Why aren't they listening to the experts? A letter has been written and signed by dozens of the nation's leading experts on economics, law, mental health, and industry, which underscores the immense human cost being wreaked by these ill-advised lockdowns. It's an experts' showdown, one side against the other, and the governments have their fingers in their ears chanting la 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 to any contrasting advice. Some people simplistically imagine greed and profit when they hear the word the economy. Compare that fallacy to the value of human life, and then consequently ignore human tragedy of unreported proportions. You see, there's a short-sighted fixation on the theoretically high number of lives saved by lockdowns, but myopically ignorant of the millions of lives destroyed by lockdowns. If very senior lives in nursing homes are cut short maybe 3 years early, each and every one is undoubtedly a tragedy. But who is to say that other lives also reduced by 3 or more years in years to come by the significant consequences of lockdown are less important? Are their premature deaths less tragic? One of the experts giving more moderated advice on the usefulness and consequences of broad lockdowns is that of Professor Paul Freitas. Professor Freitas is an international expert on well-being economics at the London School of Equability and Respect by his peers. He says economic lockdowns are causing up to 70 times more life years lost than coronavirus otherwise would. And he's not alone. According to one report, United Kingdom experts have warned indirect deaths from the pandemic due to cancer, heart attack, mental health, and more will exceed that of the virus itself. A devastated economy doesn't just have financial cost. It has a devastating human life cost, one being cavalierly ignored by those accusing dissenters of not having due regard for human life in their devotion to staying the course at any cost. And this is all in the context of telling people to take draconian and sustained erosions of natural freedom seriously for the greater good, while allowing Marxist protesters to flout basic physical distancing requirements and restrictions on assembly. It has never been more obvious just how much politics is involved in these imposed restrictions and how little common sense. It is urgent governments admit that they did their best but got it wrong and start doing what we should have always been doing. Quarantining of sick people must be strictly enforced. Isolation of high-risk people must be highly recommended, along with their personal responsibility to avoid unknowing transmission from healthy and asymptomatic people. Clusters of high-risk people in venues like nursing homes must mandate the highest standards of PPE and personal/environmental sanitizing. Everyone else must maintain basic physical distancing, hand hygiene, and cough sneeze etiquette, but otherwise be allowed natural freedoms of assembly, movement, and trade and commerce. It's just common sense, really. Quarantine is for sick people, and people at high risk should be responsible for avoiding the general public. For everyone else with a morbidity risk, if infected, no higher than a bad flu year, it should be life as normal with sensible precautions. Well, next on the show tonight, we're going to bring in our guests, and it's my pleasure to welcome, first of all, a regular contributor to The Good Source, James Macpherson. James Macpherson is the master of satire, although it seems to be being undone a lot right now. So, James, we're going to have a look at one of your articles very soon, but let's bring in everybody else. Karina Okotel is also here tonight. Welcome, Karina, and happy birthday.
Thank you very much.
The big 3-0 today. And Lyle Shelton.
4-0. You knocked a decade off me, which is nice. But
just leave people guessing. They wouldn't tell by looking. And we also have author extraordinaire with your personal autographed copy, possibly not too far away if you order it today, Lyle Shelton. And
fast forward a decade on from Karina, Dave.
Oh, really? Excellent. And Andrew Lamming is probably not far away. He's connected with us still, but his preview screen's a little black. So are you there, Lamo?
Backstage, guys.
Back of stage. Oh, there we go. Very
Coming
black right
now,
now.
I think. Yeah, just a little bit of a delay there getting through to Ormiston. You can blame the federal MP for these slack NBN services down at Bayside.
We'll have to find who the federal MP is for Ormiston and ask him to send a letter to Malcolm Turnbull's NBN. Hang on, you were a fan of Malcolm Turnbull, weren't you?
I'm always looking out for the best leader at the time. How does that sound?
That's very good. Best leader at the time. Might be the leader we have. I wish I could see your face right now as I'm teasing you.
You keep going,
mercilessly.
David, I'll fix up the technical. I'd love to hear from your other guests while I play with the vision.
We'll have a chat around and we'll see if we can get you on the screen. We'll take you off the screen while you play, or do you need to see yourself?
Yeah, leave us there. We'll play away. We'll eventually get through.
Okay, that'll be fine. Let's first of all have a look at the article today that you wrote, James. We'll have a quick look at this. I think it's absolutely fascinating. I'm just trying to pull it up on my screen. The murderer of the Coon brand. Here we go. I'm getting it. We're close. Yep, Adam's got it. Bring it up, Adam. There we go. Thank you, sir. Full screen. Writing grocery injustice. Killer of Coon brand takes aim at white milk. Seriously. Talk us through it. What's going on? What is Stephen Hagan up to now?
Well, Stephen Hagan made the news just a couple of weeks ago when he campaigned successfully for Coon cheese to be removed from Australian fridges. And encouraged by his success in that, he's now began campaigning for Paul's milk, the brand Smarter White Milk, to be removed from supermarkets because apparently it infers that it's for white people who are smarter than black people, which simply proves when you view all of life through the prism of offence, it's impossible to go anywhere without being offended.
Karina, are you offended by white milk?
I would be offended if it was another colour, if it was green or blue or something like that. I would, be very worried. But, we're talking about, firstly, Coon cheese, named after its creator, Edward Coon. Now, Paul's Smarter White Milk, as opposed to chocolate milk, strawberry milk. you know, to suggest a company is being racist when it's not, that's actual bigotry. You know, trying to destroy a company's reputation, hounding a company like Kuhn, for example, to the point where they, you know, felt they had to change their name, and now, you know, Paul's may go the same way. It is, of course, up to a company what name they carry, but to be putting pressure on a company like that when they are clearly not being racist in any way, shape or form, and suggesting that they are to the public, destroying a company's reputation in that way, that's bigotry.
Lyle, was it insensitive of Paul's to not consider how more sensitive people might respond to that? I mean, is racism in the eye of the beholder?
Oh, I think it is, David. Stephen Hagan is from my old hometown of Toowoomba, and back in the sort of 90s, early 2000s, he was waging a campaign against a grandstand at our local footy stadium, the Toowoomba Football Stadium, and there was a grandstand named after a famous Clydesdales rugby league player called E.S. Nigger Brown. Now, E.S. Nigger Brown was a white fella, but I think he ran like a black fella and sort of gained this nickname as a term of endearment. Wasn't a term of racism against the many Aboriginals that were in the Toowoomba region, and many of whom played football and were respected for their football abilities. But having E.S. Nigger Brown named after a grandstand, named on a grandstand after a well-loved player that wasn't even considered in anyone's minds as a racist thing, just really broke the heart of the Toowoomba community because it was just going too far. And then his latest campaign against Kuhn is just so ridiculous. There it is. You've got it, mate. Your producer is on the ball tonight. Well, that is no longer there. He won that. He went all the way to the United Nations and got a ruling from some United Nations committee to shame the community of Toowoomba and made us all feel like we were racists. And which of course is not the case, but he used shame to bludgeon a community into tearing off a name of one of its favourite football sons off a grandstand. And so it is in the eye of the beholder. And I just think this sort of victimhood and offence taking, as James said, has just gone way too far.
Don't you think that going all the way to the United Nations over a grandstand is the ultimate form of grandstanding? What I would love Dr. Hagan to do is to explain to me, the parent of black children, how turning racism, which is a serious subject, but how turning it into a joke, as he is doing, helps to protect my children from actual racism. Too many race activists are making too much noise for all the wrong reasons, and they are going to become like the boy who cried wolf, where they'll find no one's listening anymore. And the fact is, some of us have stopped listening because these claims of racism in every supermarket fridge have become so ridiculous.
Yeah.
And whatever you think of constitutional recognition for Indigenous people or a special voice to Parliament, if it's rejected by the Australian people, it may well be not because the Australian people are racist, but we're just weary with rubbish like this.
Yeah. So James, what happens to the town of Coonabarabran? Someone today suggested to me that Coonabarabran is the Aboriginal word for sliced cheese.
Well, of course, Coonabarabran is an Aboriginal word, but like coon cheese, it contains the term coon. So is it inherently racist?
Coonawarra is one of my favourite brands. What's going to happen to that? It's an Aboriginal word as well.
How can the AFL on the one hand celebrate the Indigenous round and on the other hand honour Adam Cooney? If these things are racist, they're racist, but they can't be sometimes racist and sometimes not racist.
I'm actually really interested, Lyle, in what you had to say about the people of Toowoomba being a bit upset, a bit precious about the stand. From an outside perspective, I have to say that was probably a fair call. I'm not 100% sure about that. You know, I mean, you're not even meant to say that word. You nowadays, of all the expletives that are far too far on TV, and what level won't people on TV go to in, you know, rudeness? They always refer to it as the N word, and
Yeah.
I like that there's something left sacred. But you know, I guess my first question is, what did they rename the stand to? Did they just call it the E.S. Brown stand and take the nickname out of it?
To be honest, I can't remember. I think they actually demolished it and they did a rebuild of the stadium. But look, the word nigger in the Australian context didn't mean what it meant in the American context, where there was slavery and the Deep South and all that. Now, look, I'm not saying it's a good term, but it wasn't used as a pejorative racial term, both in E.S. Nigger Brown's playing days or subsequently. And, you know, a good test of this was, at the time, the mayor of Toowoomba was Di Thorley, who was probably the most left-wing mayor, you know, Toowoomba has ever had. Somehow they threw up, you know, the very conservative city threw up a you know, green left mayor. But even she was totally against Stephen Hagan's campaign. And I don't think that was just because of politics. It was just so ridiculous. It clearly wasn't a racial slur. It was never meant to be. And this was being exploited as a way to try and divide the community and to make our community seem like it was something that it was not.
Andrew, welcome to the show. Good to see you. Good to hear you.
Great to be here with you, David. Great to be catching up with your fellow co-panelists, and hi everyone out there watching.
For those who don't know, Andrew Laming is the federal member for the electorate of Bowman, which is southeast of Brisbane, in the southeast of Queensland, southeast of the southeast, I guess you'd say. And he's a member of the Liberal National Party. And Andrew, I'm aware that you got into trouble very recently because there's quite a lot of people who have never seen the show Hogan's Heroes, and you put up a photo of a character from Hogan's Heroes and superimposed Anastasia Palaszczuk's face on it, mocking her bumbling incompetence and constant pleading ignorance on some issues. Now, this character in the show wears a Nazi uniform, and that's all people were willing to see in that. So give us your thoughts. Is it, you actually ended up taking that down and apologizing for that in particular. So start with your thoughts on that incident, why you felt it was necessary to apologize, and then reflect, I guess, on the racism of smarter white milk alleged.
Well, this was an incident where I was very, very happy to apologise. I wasn't aware that the Premier had any family connections back to the Second World War. For most of us that have watched sitcoms like MASH, you often forget what country it's even set in. And certainly watching Hogan's Heroes, for me, this was just the story of incredibly cool prisoners of war, and basically them having the edge over their bumbling prison guards, and Sergeant Schultz was this character who I grew up with. But the reality is, of course, that you move on in life, and not everyone keeps watching Hogan's Heroes. So while it might mean something to people in their 50s, it means nothing to those that are younger. They simply see the Nazi uniform that I'd effectively subtracted from watching it. And it's a little similar to, you're talking about that grandstand in Toowoomba. No one even takes a second look at it. But once someone raises the issue, then it's pretty hard. We refer to anything that looks anything like a Nazi uniform as an absolute no-go area in social media. And that was my mistake. And I was very happy to apologise for that. And I think it was the right thing to do as well. I wouldn't do it again. I was sharing this image, obviously produced by someone else, that I thought captured the very essence of a state that wasn't sure about whether it should open its borders or not. And Sergeant Schultz was obviously an actor. Many of them had their own connections to the Nazi period, but still engaged in that parody primarily to try and show brighter side to those that found themselves as prisoners of war and how they survived that period. I think most of us appreciated that side to it. But yeah, so that was that observation. And I've worked really hard to go as close to the line and and sail as close to the wind as I can in a lot of these areas. Mostly because you do want to constantly test community expectation. You're not in this job forever. And I don't mind having these kinds of conversations about where we look at a single problem from different perspectives and keep understanding there'll be a few views, more views than you'd often think of straight up. And social media only gives you one chance, right? So once you've posted it, screenshotted, then it gets endlessly analysed. So that raises the stakes a fair bit, but I love playing with my hands close to the fire. I mean, that's why I have a TikTok account. Why wouldn't you? Seems like heaps of fun. And honestly, if the Chinese Communist Party wants to get hold of my atrocious dance routines and chin up videos, they can have them. They're welcome to.
I'm very disappointed. I expected more from you than encouraging. I'm trying to tell my kids, get off it. The communists are watching you. They're not interested. They don't care. So thanks, Andrew. You just wrecked whatever credibility I had. Now, you actually do fly fairly close to the sun on your social media account. You have a pretty huge following. What happened to the Australian larrikin sense of humour? Have we become utter prudes with anything where we used to say, you know, have a thick skin, get over it, have a laugh at yourself because, you know, tall poppy syndrome and disdain for authority and conventions and standards? You know, famous story about Anzac diggers. I think they were on some kind of holiday in the Middle East, and they're at the beach in Egypt or somewhere, and they're down there, and they take off their T-shirts and their shirts and they're, you know, down to their boxes, and they're having a swim. A British officer comes along and he's very upset with them. And he's like, how dare you gentlemen, you know, swimming in your trunks like that? And they go, rightio, and took off their trunks as well, and then skinny dipped for the rest of the beach experience. That kind of larrikin sense of humour now seems to be extremely at risk of ending, gone.
Well, it does with internationalism, and general cultural convergence is a risk. So even when you hear Prime Minister say what is uniquely Australian, Prime Ministers on both sides will talk about values of democracy, freedom of speech and rule of law, all of these things that are common to a whole range of democracies. They're not uniquely Australian attributes, even though we're proud of them. So is New Zealand. So it self-evidently can't be uniquely Australian trait, can it? So it invites this discussion about what is uniquely Australian. I think you've hit the nail on the head. And it's that avuncular attitude, scepticism of authority, cutting down the tall poppy, and the elements you've mentioned that probably are still Australian. They're definitely still alive. But I think social media, of course, as your other guests will recognise, accentuate the extremes and can drown out the middle. And I think that's the risk we'll be talking a little bit more about tonight. I remember 7 years ago today, I put up a post and said, if you don't like Tony Abbott, you need to meet him. If you like Kevin Rudd, you should also meet him and find out. So I was doing what I could to sell Tony 7 years ago. But you know, I remember also the raids in Logan was probably the seminal moment when I just said, you know, there's raids in Logan tonight as they're tearing the place apart. You know, did any of them do a day's work, or was it business as usual and welfare on tap? And people were horrified that I would say that. I had Liberal MPs attacking me, the Mayor of Logan attacking me. But Campbell Newman went down there, did an investigation, and the conversation shifted from we need to roll in more social support and welfare money. At the end of the inquiry, it was job opportunities.
Brilliant. I just want to move the topic along now. And Karina, can you please explain to us, as the honorary Victorian, we have James in Sydney and the rest of us in God's sacred country up north of the borders. What's going on in Melbourne? What's life like there? Do you need an iron bar in your birthday cake?
Pretty much. So I went out for my one permitted shopping trip today, and it was like an absolute zombie town. Everyone's got their masks on, everyone's maintaining social distancing, which is great, but it's just, you can tell the community are completely flat. It was like a scene from 28 Days Later. It was just, yeah, not great. People are confused about the rules. I am. Still waiting to hear about whether I can keep sending my kids to childcare or not.
Wow.
Yeah, which is, you know, all of these things are actually stressful. And then you think about people who've lost their jobs. Hairdressers now aren't allowed to open. all of those stresses are quite incredible. And your editorial at the start really captured that, Dave. But you know, one of the things that, you know, very few people are talking about is what are the long-term mental health impacts on people in lockdown. There haven't been any studies into that because, you know, it would be unethical to carry out a trial to see, you know, what locking up, in particular children, young children, for such a long period of time can be. You know, we're only allowed 1 hour of exercise a day.
Go through the restrictions for me. For those of us outside Victoria, for those of us who prefer not to watch a regular diet of mainstream media, what exactly is different in Victoria from the rest of the nation? What aren't you allowed to do? What do you have to do that we wouldn't know about?
So, yeah, if you're outside the home, you need to wear a mask. You can only go exercising for 1 hour a day within a 5 kilometre radius. You can only go to the supermarket within a 5 kilometre radius, which some people have pointed out is impossible because if they live in a more outer suburban area, their local supermarket might be 8 kilometres away. They're confused about, you know, now whether they can go shopping. Some people, you know, within that 5 kilometre radius, the local supermarket might be one that's quite expensive, and so they're wondering how they might be able to meet their, you know, grocery bills now. The supermarkets are wiped out of meat because the
meat. I heard Daniel Andrews saying we have to rationalise meat.
Yeah, so there's new restrictions for the
rationing food in peacetime.
Yeah, it's quite incredible. Even the fruit and veg were, you know, it was pretty barren. But, you know, only permitted workers, and nobody's quite clear on what a permitted worker is, are allowed to send their children for on-site supervision at school during remote learning. Imagine the same restrictions will come in for childcare, but we won't know till Thursday. I got, you know, a message from our childcare centre this evening, which was, you know, a bit sad to see because that means that they're working late into the evening, saying they haven't heard from the government about what the restrictions will be. Maybe by Thursday, they will, by tomorrow, they'll be able to tell us what's going to happen on Thursday. But a whole range of shops that were previously able to open are now closed, and that is having a devastating impact on employment. It's expected that we'll now see, you know, 250,000 people lose their jobs, and it's terrific.
I want to keep moving along. I want to get to hydroxychloroquine before the end of the hour. But Andrew, can you just enlighten us? What are your thoughts on letting people under 60 with very low morbidity risk get on with their life while protecting people at very high risk?
Well, we have to balance up these individual rights, because once we allow that, we would then remove the right of other individuals to benefit from not being exposed to either those that are infectious or asymptomatic and potentially infectious.
But isn't it their responsibility to prevent their exposure?
So we saw Sweden have a crack at this, and they've ended up with half our population with 26 times as many deaths. So most people are a bit reluctant because they know that no matter how hard you try, you actually can't protect the vulnerable. Firstly, because the vulnerable aren't just all the aged. That's a proxy for vulnerability, but vulnerability is actually chronic disease. So the more chronic diseases you have, the more likely you are to be knocked off the perch with COVID if it comes along. So we don't yet have a really good counterfactual, because your argument is compelling, but we can't see a country that's done it successfully.
What about Taiwan, Andrew? What about Taiwan? So they've avoided a hard lockdown.
That's right. So Taiwan is definitely the leader in the pack, but it's also an outcome that no other country has been able to achieve. And part of that is probably the Taiwanese population's military discipline and ability to follow those tight lockdowns. They're also a very early border closing country. So the steps of borders, testing, tracing and distancing. Quarantining isn't part of this, right? So we only quarantine someone that we think could be carrying the infection or is waiting a day or two for their test result. So quarantine isn't actually something that's widely used until things are completely out of control. So keep in mind, we have 7 out of 8 jurisdictions that are doing the right thing. Their aged care facilities have kept the disease away from the vulnerable populations, which I'm sure you'd support. The question is just a matter of how far we can nudge the dial and relax and not end up like Victoria. The question would be, is everyone willing to be Victoria right now, or they prefer to be the other 7 jurisdictions?
Well, the issue is that in Victoria, we, by and large, the majority have been doing the right thing. We have been compliant with the restrictions. The issue has been that our state government, the Andrews Labor government, have really botched things up. I mean, after the first wave in New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian, she actually took measures to improve the healthcare system. In Victoria, nothing was done. It still takes a long time for the COVID test results to come back. You know, the quarantine debacle, employing a private company who had no background in managing, you know, health and quarantine measures, and, you know, allowing cases to get out of hand like that. Completely unbelievable, yet no responsibility is still taken by the Andrews government. Even today in his press conference, he was telling us off for, you know, everything we're doing wrong. We now have, you know, if you breach the quarantine, the restrictions, you could face up to a $5,000 fine. We were basically being told off like little children. And it's really demoralising. I think that,
Andrew, tell me about
the are they? Because they've lost control and they're now trying to catch up.
Yeah.
I think your Taiwan question is still good, but there's a whole ton of causal links and associated factors that actually have nothing to do with Taiwan's stellar performance. I think the most likely one is that Taiwan actually, on the bell curve of idiocy, just has very, very small tails. We've just got too many people that are going to take a flight to Melbourne and go shopping for handbags. And as long as that happens, both they and even emergency services workers are going to continue to spread the disease into that vulnerable population that we're trying to protect. So in answer to your question, I don't think any country's protected their vulnerable. No matter what we do, COVID will find a way it's in simply through human movement. And so in that case, you end up in the worst of both worlds, because you've got 10 times as much COVID being pumped into your vulnerable population, and there's really no way to stop it. So at the moment,
my question is, if you can lock down and protect your old people,
you can't.
Why do you have? If you can't, then why are we locking down and protecting anybody?
Because you're doing as much as you possibly can. You'll never protect them or save them completely.
Yeah, but at what cost?
Yeah.
Here's the thing: at what cost? If we're costing 10,000 lives to save 1,000, feeling good about 1,000 is really a philosophical dilemma. The trolley problem. It's like, well, we've chosen to kill the greater number of people to spare the one.
Yeah, I'm not convinced there's more people that are dying from COVID measures. I just need to see that evidence. But look, in short, you're right. There's no counterfactual, so I can't put up any nation that's doing what you're saying. But keep in mind that if we take your path, we simply have an inverted situation, a corollary where people can then say their rights are similarly curtailed, because you're allowing people with COVID potentially to move freely through the population and infect people that under the current circumstances wouldn't be infected and wouldn't die. And keep in mind, it's not just a matter of a runny nose for 20 days. There are serious long-term effects with COVID that are paradoxical, unpredictable, and we don't know who gets them and who doesn't. So if you ask me, do I want to put my hand up and cop COVID for herd immunity, I'd probably say no.
Yeah, can I just jump in there, Dave?
Yes,
I've heard rumours to that effect, Andrew, and that there potentially is long-term effects on even younger people like us who might get the disease. You seem to be alluding to that, but we haven't heard that discussed a lot in the media, and that might be a strong argument in favour of these hard lockdowns that we're seeing.
Yeah, talk about
possibly
the known effects as opposed to speculated. What is we see some people saying, somebody today, you're not worried about the effects on young people of long-term heart damage and other stuff. What are they talking about? What's out there? What's known?
Well, they're describing a Kawasaki syndrome type vasculitis that's associated with autoimmune and inflammatory responses. And so technically, if you get 100,000 people infected, you're going to get 100 of those Kawasaki's. In Australia, with only 2,000 cases, for instance, you're only going to see 1 or 2. So the more you allow it to move through the population, so to speak, pre-vaccine, the more you have a risk of these unpredictable longer-term cases. They're being reported in countries where they had huge numbers. We won't see them in Australia. So our health system, you're right, has not been tested. I'm saying we'll have a vaccine first half of next year. The question is, what do we want to do between now and then? Because the vaccine, to me, is the end point, and I'm confident with human trials starting in Adelaide this week that there's a few more behind Adelaide that won't be far off.
But the head of the World Health Organization said today that, we may not see a vaccine. Yes, there's hope there, but, countries need to consider the fact that, we may not ever see a vaccine. There's never been a vaccine for a coronavirus developed before. So, it could be the unicorn that we're trying to chase and hope that that's, the answer to everything without thinking about, what if a vaccine doesn't exist? You think about HIV. There is no vaccine, but there are, drugs and treatments that are available. And again, medical experts are talking about the need to look to not just a vaccine, but other forms of cure, other forms of treatment. And I suppose that segues into, your discussion on chloroquine as well, Dave. But I'll leave that for the moment.
not just yet. Let's have a look at this this graph. An update from Sweden. Last week, fewer COVID-19 deaths, fewer new cases, fewer people in ICU than Victoria, despite having a bigger population. It is also below average deaths for this time of year. Your thoughts on that, Andrew?
Well, first of all, they've wiped out all their sick people over the last 6 months. There's almost none left, right? So the vulnerable are all dead.
That's a tad cynical.
So we know that there's an annual death rate, and basically COVID will take out anyone who's likely to die in the next 12 months. You'll die of COVID if you're in Sweden. So they're already dead. So now you've got a fitter remaining population when you've wiped out your 50,000 sickest people, and they haven't had a second wave, which is great, but their level of immunity is still, I think, around 20%. So there's no herd immunity in Sweden, and there's no guarantee they won't have a second wave.
Now, what about the infection or the mortality rate that we've established here with, a quarter to 500,000 people in Australia or estimated, according to antibody studies? I can't remember the technical word. Doesn't really matter. For those watching, in case you don't know, Andrew Laming, professional career as a MD prior to this. What was your area of specialties, or were you GP?
So I did a bit of infectious disease out in Aboriginal Australia, looking at chlamydial infection, and
fantastic,
and then a bit of surgery after that. But I was pretty rotten. Had shaky hands. Never did really great eye surgery.
I would make a terrible brain surgeon.
They sent me out to pasture, which I thought was pretty mean. No. So I still do eye surgery, but don't claim to be an infectious disease physician. Look, it's a great question what Sweden is doing, but from a medical point of view, we don't want to overrun the system. I think we're now well prepared in all states to be able to handle a second wave. Queensland and South Australia will get it under control very quickly. New South Wales on the cusp. But once it gets to the point where you simply can't meaningfully contact trace, that's where Victoria is. And so they're in a real deep problem, and they move from shutdown to lockdown for that purpose.
So here's I just want to ask. I want to try and move on, but let me come back to you, Lyle, and then come back to me. So you first.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, sorry, Dave. I know you want to move on, but your editorial at the start, very much mirrored what many of the commentators on Sky News are saying, Rowan Dean and Andrew Bolton.
I don't get access.
Yeah, well, my wife and I have subscribed to Sky for the first time in the last 2 or 3 months, and we just end up yelling at the TV all the time. But they have been very much promoting the Taiwanese model, that the lockdowns are too harsh. There's got to be other ways to let people do the social distancing without these hard lockdowns that destroy the economy and do all the things that Dave so eloquently said at the start. Andrew, obviously the Morrison government, which is a conservative government, isn't obviously taking its cues from Sky News, but a lot of conservative people watch Sky and probably are a bit perplexed as to why the Morrison government, would be supporting hard stage 4 lockdowns like we've got in Victoria, and perhaps isn't open to more of the discussion. I know we're coming to the discussion about I can't pronounce hydrochloroquine or whatever it is.
Yes.
Let me show up. I got it down pat.
You must have, evidence as a member of the government. And to me, I think it would be helpful if the government could, prosecute its message a little bit better, because I think a lot of conservative people who watch Sky After Dark, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I think Sky has a lot to offer, but I think people are perplexed and confused about the messages.
So I think the PM was his genius move was creating national cabinet, where effectively he brought the states around the table and then gave them 100% of the responsibility. And he only announces decisions that are unanimous from premiers, but he doesn't ever tell premiers what to do. As I said, borders are our responsibility. Testing, tracing, distancing is then completely left to the states, as all of these elements are that you're asking me about. So in answer to vaccine dates, look, this was expectation management from WHO. There's nothing that hard about making a vaccine, kill vaccine, recombinant techniques. It will happen, guaranteed. It's a delicate RNA virus, so it can switch and mutate. I think someone's pointed that out in the commentary, and that's why we make a new flu vax every year. So we're definitely going to get there. The PM will not be stepping on any toes. The PM won't be undermining any premiers. He would well know there'll be an inquiry. Good time for that. The Victorian opposition is ruthless with Andrews, and Tim Smith in particular gaining notoriety by taking on the public health movement in Victoria. So the opposition is doing their job down there. In Queensland, it's a little harder because obviously if you kept disease out, you look like the good guy. So that does put Jeff Fredington in a far more difficult position. And we moved on to the cruise ship debacle of New South Wales. So
we're just starting to lose your audio pretty badly there, Andrew.
The PM doesn't push any of these premiers around. And I've had private communication with them. They feel now that they want to work and support him as much as they are supporting them publicly. So this is a very interesting dynamic. It's now replaced COAG, and the big question really is, what's the future of National Cabinet after COVID?
Yep. Well, I think the key thing that I want to see is sustainable. What's sustainable? And if we can't do this forever, then we shouldn't be doing it now. We've just lost Andrew's technology there. Apologies. Hopefully we'll see him back soon, because I want to ask about that terribly banned word which Lyle struggled with, hydroxychloroquine. We can do it together. Hydroxychloroquine. There we go. There we go. So picture isn't working. Oh, no. Cool. Got it. Yeah. So I want to see a result that's sustainable. If lockdown is sustainable, we can achieve this. Great. Let's do it. But if it's not sustainable, this virus isn't going anywhere. Doing it for a day is just ridiculous if it's not going to make a difference, if it's not going to provide a solution. And so we shouldn't be doing anything that isn't sustainable. And it's not going to go anywhere. If we don't utterly eradicate it, which is impossible, then it's just going to bounce back. That's my opinion, and happy to hear really good arguments for it. People comparing Australia to Sweden, I don't think is comparable. Completely different environments. For a start, we've heard that the virus has a half-life of 90 seconds in direct sunlight with moderate temperature and humidity. You're not going to get that in Sweden in the middle of their winter. To compare them to Australia and say their results are a direct outcome of their methods is just ridiculous. They're not comparable at all. It's a terrible, non-equivalent comparison. James, have you got any thoughts? Tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah, you're wrong, Dave. Why are you wrong? Well, look, I agree with you that whatever we do needs to be sustainable, but I think we're in a period at the moment where long-term sustainability is probably not the issue. We are hopeful that there will be a vaccine soon, as Andrew said, and I think it's preferable to take our chances by constraining activity in the hope that we will quickly have a vaccine. I know it seems like this has been forever, but it's only been since March. The problem is that we almost had coronavirus under control. We still had some restrictions, but by and large, we were pretty much able to get back to normality. And then through a series of blunders, Andrew talked about the fact that Taiwan have done well because they have less idiots. Maybe they don't. Maybe we have the same amount of idiots. It's just our idiots are in government.
Exactly.
And they made some terrible mistakes. I think your editorial itemized them very well, so I won't attempt to better that. And what was under control or getting under control has now blown out in Victoria and set us right back. I think as horrible as the lockdown is, I think it's worth pursuing it for 6 weeks to see if we can't get it back under control and buy ourselves enough time to get a vaccine. The alternative is we have to accept the fact that numbers of people will die. Now, people die. That's a reality of life. We'd rather we didn't have people die because of coronavirus. That may be the end point. But right now, I think we're still trying to buy ourselves enough time to get to a vaccine if our government officials will lead us well.
And James, what if, as the head of the World Health Organization indicated today, we may never see a vaccine? What then? Fortunately,
the head of the World Health Organization has already revealed himself to be completely hopeless at everything.
Indeed. And if he's saying we may never have a vaccine, I mean, come on. If he's saying it.
I don't think he has much of a clue about anything. I'd rather, I'd put a lot more faith in what Andrew Laming says than what the head of the World Health Organization says.
Even though we've never had a vaccine for a coronavirus before?
Well, there's a lot of things we've never had before, and then we had them. So,
I allow for people being optimistic. I'm optimistic that a partial lockdown would be just as effective of preventing fatalities from this as a complete lockdown. I guess we can speculate comfortably as armchair quarterbacks without any real test on our opinions. So that kind of pressure. Let's welcome back Andrew Laming, who's got his NBN sorted again. And I just want to have a look at this article from a couple of days ago, 29th of July, I wrote this. And the headline, Twitter, Facebook and YouTube censor frontline doctors claiming hydroxychloroquine prevents and cures coronavirus. The major irony in this is that an article about social media censorship was censored by social media. They took it down within a day or so. Now, in this, I actually, right down the bottom, we're going to be able to see that, I mean, they censored everybody who tried to share the video itself. And I thought, I'm going to be good and not share the video. I'll describe what's in it, the same kind of content that was on major news outlets, and lots of reporting about the reporting, what the social media spokespeople had to say. And I spoke critically about the mainstream reporting of this, just utterly dismissing these doctors that dissented from the accepted dogma, as if they had no idea what they were talking about, even though they've personally treated hundreds of patients with COVID-19. But I also exposed the fact that the FDC and the WHO, the American Health Organization and the Global Health Organization, who had stymied and basically said, look, nobody use hydroxychloroquine, it's going to cause major health concerns, had based their conclusions and their warnings, their decisions on a fraudulent article, which was later retracted by the major publications, including The Lancet, that was published in. Then I went on to describe the investigations that are going on in Australia. Professor Ian Wicks is the lead investigator of the Australian study testing the inexplicably controversial antiviral drug as a preventative treatment against coronavirus. Let me just read what he had to say, quoting this Australian professor. And I heard him interviewed on the ABC. He's basically saying, I don't care what Donald Trump thinks. It doesn't make me think less of hydroxychloroquine. It doesn't make me think more of hydroxychloroquine. I just want the trial and the science to speak for itself without politics. Imagine that. Quoting him, he says, we don't think it fundamentally changes anything that we were planning to do. Speaking about the FDC and FDC. I think I'll go there. Anyway, the American people and the FDA. Thank you. Thinking party things, but anyway, the FDA and the WHO, their decision doesn't change anything we were planning to do. The Lancet study is quite different to ours in a few respects. Even the authors sounded a note of caution about the design of the study and pointed out that randomized controlled trials were necessary to draw a firm conclusion, and that their study had no implications for preventative prophylactic trials. While we obviously all have to take new information as it arises on board, we think there are good reasons to separate what we're doing, studying hydroxychloroquine as a preventative, from what's being reported. This idea came in part out of our experience in rheumatology of widely prescribing hydroxychloroquine for its preventative value against flare-ups in diseases like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, where we use it very routinely and are pretty comfortable with its side effect profile in that group. Not dangerous. That combined, he didn't say that, that was my little side. Continuing the quote, that combined with the evidence from in vitro studies where it has an antiviral effect on coronavirus, led us down this path. We felt obliged to pursue it as a possibility that might offer an extra degree of protection in healthcare workers in particular. We're trying to produce gold standard scientific evidence for efficacy one way or another. If the trial's negative, hopefully it will put the issue to bed. So I guess, Andrew, what do you think? Hydroxychloroquine, is there, tell us, just start wherever you think, say whatever you want.
Sure. So hydroxychloroquine was a drug that we were shoveling into armed forces who were serving in tropical regions. And when you treated hundreds of thousands of GIs, eventually you got some side effects. But we're fairly confident with its use in specific conditions for its anti-inflammatory effects. But what they're trying to do here with COVID is combine it with zinc and a micronutrient, and of course azithromycin, a macrolide, a variant of erythromycin. We've all taken that, and often gives you pain in the tummy, but it's a very good antibacterial. But none of these are antivirals, right? So let's be clear. This is about treating the inflammatory reaction that in the cytokine storm that occurs at day 10, where people either get better within a week or they're dead within a week. That day 10 turn of events, you need to be dosed up apparently on all of these three agents. And studies have not always tried the three working together, and studies haven't always introduced these drugs early enough, they say, to have an effect. So the science is completely inconclusive, and science doesn't move quickly. This is the problem. These researchers need to release their data, and it has to be replicable, that it's both safe and effective. It just hasn't happened yet. My sense is I don't think it ever will be shown to be effective, but individual studies need to be added together, their weaknesses accounted for, the level of the evidence and the power of the study needs to be basically added systemically into a review. And we can't do that yet because it's so early. And the studies are all so different. They're very hard to combine. The answer here is science makes decisions very slowly. And in a few months, you just can't get a clear answer. Those that are absolutely behind hydroxychloroquine say you must start on it really early, long before that cytokine storm at day 10. Most of the studies, they started too late in the system to make any difference. Then they're trying to combine it, as I said, with other adjuvants to work better. Right. The jury is still out.
Now, I don't have a dog in this fight, so I don't care one way or another, other than wishful thinking. It'd be nice to have a cure, preventative, something that works, especially something that 50 different pharmaceutical companies make. And it's fair to cynically suspect that there might be some profit motives in stopping this from some people. What I want to know is, without having intentionally answered my question before I asked it, why would any government stop a doctor and patient prescribing and agreeing to this course of treatment?
Well, if you haven't demonstrated safety and efficacy, then a doctor is effectively using a pharmaceutical off-label. Now, that happens all the time, but the minute a complaint is lodged for off-label treatment, then the GP has to be able to provide the evidence for what they're doing, or that doctor can find themselves before the medical board. And then, of course, it erupts, and you've got the view that is there's no scientific consensus yet on the use of that drug. So that's how it breaks down. Off-label use, it's not currently a recommended treatment.
So Andrew, on Sky, again, reverting to my favourite source of news, Sky After Dark, your colleague Craig Kelly was being interviewed by Andrew Bolt last night after Kelly copped, an absolute smashing by the usual suspects in the left for daring to mention a drug that Donald Trump suggested might, have some efficacy. But Kelly said that there are studies which show that this does work, and he conceded that there are studies that show there's some doubt. So there's mixed messages, and his argument was, well, let's have the debate about it. But your very eloquent answer to Dave's earlier question suggests that it's never been demonstrated as having efficacy for a coronavirus.
No, there are studies that show impact. There are studies that show a difference in a mortality rate or a clinical outcome, but there's so many studies that don't show that when you systemically analyse them together as a group, and you simply can't pick and choose your studies. That's the problem. That's what Craig's doing. But what science demands is that you rigorously describe inclusion-exclusion criteria for studies. You then assign them a level 1, 2, 3, 4 for their power, and then you have to weight those studies on their biases, their completeness, and their methodological approaches. And this is all done ruthlessly. And lastly, those researchers have to release their data to prove it's replicable, and that hasn't always been forthcoming. So that's why we're where we are at the moment. Science can't make these decisions quickly.
From a layman non-scientist, what I'm hearing, and I'm submitting this to you for clarification in case I'm just not hearing it right, is on one hand, we've got studies which say there's either some or a lot of benefit, especially early on, and probably not when it's advanced and you're in intensive care or emergency.
Yep.
But on the other hand, we've got studies which say, probably no benefit. It seems like no benefit isn't a good reason to interfere with the doctor prescribing it, or to contradict the other studies which are at the very least a good foundation for hope.
And this is at the heart of what we call empirical skepticism. It's called the Null Hypothesis, and positivist quantitative researchers, which is the heart of medicine, the largest field of human knowledge there's ever been, start from the position that it doesn't work. And then they prove their way out of there. And that's just a tradition of modern science.
Rightio.
But if patients are willing to consent and sign the proper consents, and doctors are happy to participate in trials, why can't that happen? I mean, Daniel Andrews, again, in Victoria, he's banned the use of chloroquine. And it's quite astonishing to me. I mean, my family, my other half's family, come from Uganda, and chloroquine is just a common treatment for malaria. My husband had malaria for a year and took chloroquine for a year, and he's healthier than I am. So, and in a lot of African countries, they're using chloroquine because they don't have access to, PPE, and even masks sometimes. They're taking it as a prophylaxis. So if that is happening, why can't that evidence, I suppose, or even research or trials be relied upon? Also in Qatar, they did use chloroquine as part of a multifaceted antivirus strategy. And if I can look at these figures here, there have been 100,000 cases and only 169 deaths in Qatar. In Australia, we've had, as of today, 18,318 cases and 221 deaths. So more deaths, far less cases. And they were using chloroquine as part of their strategy to combat coronavirus. So why can't we at least try?
We're going to come to Andrew's answer in just a second. Andrew, hold that thought. Just want to wrap up formally the show. We're 9 minutes over time. We're now into the overtime section of the show. We're going to go for another 10-15 minutes. We're going to answer questions from some viewers and finish off these thoughts and etc. But I just want to thank the panelists for coming tonight. If you wanted to head off after the hour, now's the time. But Andrew Laming, really appreciate your medical and political insights, defending the government position and explaining the science for us non-doctors. Thank you very much. I really appreciated your time and your company tonight.
Pleasure. Been great being with everyone. Thank you.
And Karina Okotel and Lyle Shelton and James Macpherson, regular contributors to Good Source, and you can get heaps and heaps of content from them. Lyle Shelton's show is coming out tomorrow morning. Make sure you head to goodsource.news as you wake up. And
did I mention that I had a book, David?
You'll find some. You should get the book, and when you look at his show on goodsource.news, there'll be a link on the bottom of the right-hand side. You can buy that book, but you have to watch the show because there's stuff in the show about the book that's not in the book. Lots of photos and things that you'll get there that are pretty exciting. And of course, we've also had James Macpherson's show come out this morning. It's not too late to get a very good laugh. Little tip, there are a couple of songs from James in that. And as I was producing the podcast last night, I was red in the face, just laughing hysterically as I'm putting James singing over the top of some karaoke tracks. And I think it turned out very well. So have a listen. Let me know what you think. And of course, Karina, this Friday afternoon, evening, the weekly wrap-up, telling us what's happening from lockdown in Victoriastan. Let's move into overtime. And Andrew, do you need Karina to recap that question for you?
No, that's fine. I agree with everything Karina said. If you look at Qatar's numbers are unbelievable, very impressive. They have got some very strong medical systems in the Middle East in the last 10 years. And the only question that I wanted to know is, was chloroquine a significant reason for those amazing figures, or were they possibly doing other things, in which case some use of chloroquine may well be an associated factor, but not causally linked to those great numbers, but no doubting they're great numbers.
And why can't we, countries work together and share that information? That's the sad thing, here again in Victoria. And what authority does Daniel Andrews have to ban a drug? I'm not sure, because, my understanding is that it's the federal government that they allows the use of drugs. But, why can't we at least try if there is evidence?
So he controls the Poisons Acts. That's all state and territory. I suggest he'd be recategorising chloroquine to prevent it. Agree with you 100% that no one should be banning any trials of anything, but of course he will have a fair bit of influence over both the public hospitals and the university ethics committees that decide what to approve and what not to. There are hundreds of chloroquine trials out there, but unfortunately they're not conclusive enough. It's very much looks like that to me. I'd like to see more research, not less, but at this stage, all of the data, when you take it all together, is not yet conclusive.
So is Craig Kelly being asked to stand down on this, Andrew?
No, certainly Scott Morrison is very, very low key on allowing MPs to speak. If he's speaking to Craig Kelly, I don't know about it. But no, we haven't, since Tony Abbott was quite a micromanager of backbenchers, but both Malcolm and Scott allow us to speak completely freely. And as I said last night on Quanda, Craig's not in the cabinet, so he doesn't speak for the government.
Hashtag not Q&A. Right up there on the screen. I missed that. I should have watched you on there last night. I didn't even know you were on there last night. I'm so sorry, Andrew. What was interesting? What was outrage? Vent. What was frustrating on you're actually fairly unflappable, but let's pretend you're flappable. What would have got any other Conservative flapped last night on Q&A?
Well, mashing lefties is my pastime. So I've spent the last 24 hours wiping the green blood off me. And it was a very successful appearance, very happy, enjoyed it. It was done from my living room. First time that this show has ever done two politicians from their home. And look, it's a little hard doing it into a camera because we're only on screen, obviously, and you don't get to respond to anything. So basically the government MPs put up, they then just simply abuse you for the next 5 minutes, then they come back for more meat. But no, very happy we got the message out and made it pretty clear that the government is fully behind Victoria and helping them through.
Well, we've had a few detractors on here tonight. I don't know if you've seen. I know you've got a thick skin and you're unflappable. I think there's something about you being educated by Big Pharma. So that's a doctor qualification for you. What did we have? We had in the comments, we had Elizabeth Oakman asking if anyone filmed me producing the podcast last night because she wants to see me red in the face with laughter. No, we don't film me just working. It's very boring.
We should have the reaction.
No, well, yeah, maybe. But I had my headphones on, and so nobody else in the house can hear what I'm hearing. But I'm just laughing out loud, roaring, and my 15-year-old comes in. I share it with him. He's like, "That's not funny." So if you're not 15, if you are 15, don't watch it. You know, it's just might not be the laugh I promised. Anybody who remembers the Beach Boys or Roy Orbison, you will laugh your head off. So very good. Brilliant. Sandra Marie says Australia, Victoria has tested more people than others like America and has more cases than England because they have tested more people. At what point does testing actually matter, and to what extent, particularly when pawpaws test positive? I want to, you're obviously talking about, I think it was Nigeria. Was it Nigeria or Mozambique? Zimbabwe? One of those African countries. If I name enough, I'll probably get it right eventually. But I didn't say anything racist. They apparently tested pawpaws and something else, and they came back positive with some of the tests the WHO had sent them. But Andrew, do you debate or see what I'm saying with the number of cases being a nearly irrelevant number that is sensationalized nonetheless every day?
I don't think that the number of cases is distorted greatly by how much we test. There was this big debate with President Trump saying the more we test, the more we find. Just to separate two issues, what we're looking for when we're testing is the possibility of asymptomatic positives in their 1 or 2 days where they don't realise they've got the disease in an effort to prevent spread. But we've done exhaustive testing in the Australian community, and there's very few positives ever found. We might test 5,000 and find one. That's different to previous exposure and having immunoglobulin, which is either thymus or bone marrow T cells rolling around, indicating that you've had some exposure. In those cases, as you're mentioning, there are hundreds of thousands of Australians that come up as having had some form of previous exposure, but we don't know if they're actually immunologically protected at that level and for how long. So just separating that out, we do test in Australia, but we find really no extra cases of any significance. But previous exposure is important, but it's still, as you've said yourself, only about 2% of Australians showing up with any form of previous exposure.
But 2% is a massive number, massively higher than they're currently touting as the number of cases.
So that's right, except we probably don't, with the flu, go and do that kind of testing either. So if we did that with flu, we'd also do the same with those numbers. So you're comparing it to flu, but of course we don't go and test widely in the community for flu either. You know, we only just take the odd blood test at the GP. So that's the difference. And the second difference, of course, is that 48 hours of asymptomatic infectivity that all cases we believe have. And we think that in that time, every person infects at least 2 people with COVID. That's not the case with influenza. It's less than 1. So that's really the really big difference between the two diseases.
Right.
Hey, Andrew, are you pitching for the role of Australia's next Chief Medical Officer?
No, I think they've done a great job. And this is probably the first time in history that we've allowed the experts to actually tell the politicians what to do, because it's always been the other way around.
The medical experts, not all the experts. Just the medical experts. As a compliment,
Andrew, I'm really impressed by the way you understand this in such a detailed manner. I mean, it really is impressive. As I say, I need to broaden my education beyond Sky After Dark.
Hey, Andrew, what does a chief medical officer do when there's no pandemic going on? We've never heard of them before.
Preparedness. And this process started 20 years ago. They start thinking about how we'd respond, what an operational control room would look like, how many masks are stored, what the task force looks like for purchasing PPE, how to secure those supply lines. Yeah, it's a fascinating role. And that's just for pandemic, but they're responsible for the entire vaccine system, for deciding what to and what not to recommend, what messages the government should be providing. It's quite a busy job, and every state has not only a medical officer, some have a public health officer, some have a state nurse, and they're moving to, the chief midwife. I'm sure there'll be a chief radiographer one day as well.
So cool. Hey, we've got a question here. It's got a typo, but we'll forgive it. Is it true that if you get the flu shot, you increase your risk of getting COVID?
Absolutely not. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. We do know that flu has fallen through the floor this year because no one's out and about. So it's been a really unusual flu season.
Yeah, obviously. Awesome. Any other questions? Let's start wrapping this up. If you've got a question and you're watching, please throw it up on the screen. Look, just a little promo for The Good Source. We are getting quite intense with the amount of articles and opinions, editorials that we're producing. The difference between The Good Source and any other conservative website in Australia is we're producing media, videos and podcasts for you to consume non-stop. We're promoting independent voices. We're up to 10 now. With the addition recently of Corin Barraclough with a great weekly show launched on yesterday. So check that out. But we can't sustain this without your involvement, without your support. So if you're finding enjoyment and value out of this, would you please voluntarily put your hand in your pocket for $5, $10, $20 a month and just become a monthly partner. There's no paywalls or subscriptions required for this. At this stage, I've still got advertising kept off the website. It's very tempting to put it on, but I really love the experience of a beautiful, clean news read that you can watch without ads popping up left, right, and center. If you like that too, if you want us to stick around, please become a partner, and that would be really great to displace the corporate advertising sales media in Australia and have just a bunch of independent voices with no corporate control or agenda, no taxpayer subsidy against people's will. If you like it, help it. And if you can't, enjoy it for free. And if you don't like it, well, what are you doing here? But we enjoy having a conversation with you and hope that we can keep doing this for a very long time. And next year, let's even see if we can make a nightly news broadcast that won't exacerbate racial divides in Australia. Right. Any other questions going on? Elizabeth says the website's looking fab. Why, thank you, Elizabeth.
Dave, can I
jump in?
I've been stewing all night about the Sergeant Schultz thing, Andrew. When I saw you take that down and I listened to your explanation carefully, I do think this is the death of larrikinism in Australia. And, I wouldn't want to diminish or demean Anastasia Palaszczuk's, family experience at all. And I don't think anyone would, and you certainly weren't wanting to do that. But if you can't anymore, use the Sergeant Schultz I know nothing example, we really are killing larrikinism and fun and things that are, part of our culture. It's like John Cleese, don't mention the war. I mean, this is just getting ridiculous now. And I just think you should have stood your ground, Andrew, and by all means say, look, make the overtures to Anastasia Palaszczuk, but let's not destroy larrikinism.
What do you think, Karina? I'll throw it to you down south.
Yeah, look, I appreciate, that people can take offence, and we, if it does stir up, I suppose, people's feelings of being victimised, persecuted, then that does need to be addressed. But I agree with Lyle, where offence isn't intended, where it is something that is said in parody or jest, in the spirit of larrikinism, then that's something that's very different. It goes back to the issue of the coon cheese and the smarter white milk, again, not intended to be racist, but people can pull out that card of, and to deflect from the issue that, she's avoiding the questions, and then throw it back on you, or, in other circumstances, to say, don't look at me, but this person is persecuting me, even though you are not. That's not your intention. And, certainly I think you did the right thing, apologising if she does feel offence, but I do have suspicion that perhaps that might have been born out of wanting to deflect from you pointing the finger at her on her incompetence. Again,
Just a small point. I took an unusual tack with that one. I went onto the Channel 9 News and said, absolutely no way do I apologise, stand my ground. This is a sitcom. It's an American actor. It's about the fact that she knows nothing. And then I went back to social media where I'd originally posted it, and I posted an apology there using the same channel that I'd used for an original meme to post an apology. So I tried a narrow-casted apology back to those who I thought were most likely to be kicking this down the road, but I wanted the middle class non-social media majority to know that I was standing my ground. So I tried that approach, and I think it worked reasonably well.
And correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't the person who played Sergeant Schultz the direct descendant? Wasn't he his father or mother or some direct family actually in Auschwitz or another concentration camp, extermination camp?
That's quite right. And he was asked many times why he played that role, and he said that he wanted to, shed light on that phase in history and not allowed to be forgotten. So that was what drove him to be the actor. Quite interesting. But again, it's getting into too many levels of detail for the average person.
Well, it is and it isn't.
The irony.
I think I'm tempted to say 6 to 1, half a dozen to the other. You maybe couldn't have made a wrong decision. Apologize, and it's sensitive, gracious, and generous of you. But on the other hand, this cancel culture, you can't apologize to them, because the second you give an inch, they will take a mile. Give them a spoon and they'll stab you in the heart with it.
I hadn't apologized on mainstream media. That rankled them no end. What they needed was to humiliate me on free-to-air TV. And because I put it right back where I'd originally posted an apology next to it, and I left the apology there so that people would see it, but they were furious that they couldn't get that apology into the mainstream media and diminish or corrode what I've done. So I think it was quite effective to say, I'm going to apologise to the people who are amped about it, but over here, for those who appreciate that larrikin sense of humour or understand the context, for them, I stood my ground. You might say that's walking both sides of the street, but it was also a specific message for two different groups of people who saw it two different ways.
Do you think anyone would use Sergeant Schultz again in parody as a way to, make a political point? Again, having watched, what you've been through, Andrew, and watching, and I appreciate why you've apologised, but it effectively means now anyone who's seen that, Sergeant Schultz is cancelled.
Well, there's a cancel culture discussion, but above and beyond that, there is simply Nazism. And I just have to concede that the minute this was brought to my attention, I don't think any MP can condone, can brush over anything to do with Nazism and anti-Semitism. So I think that one element, I've often thought to myself, what if it was the Chinese president and we pop the face on there? I don't think it'd be a problem. What if it was Stalin, person arguably, equally, horrific part of history.
By a factor of 10.
Yeah,
that's right.
Worse
So,
than Hitler.
My wife is ethnically Russian, and people from all different countries will often say, you bloody Russians, you gave us Stalin. And she said, well, before you attack me too much, remember he killed many more Russians than he did from any other country. So, look, I think that it's just Nazism. And the minute we touch that, what I call third rail, I just think you have to demonstrate separation from it.
Yep. All right, just wrapping it up for tonight. Very lovely channel asks, is Lyle's battle with the drag queen activists going okay? Give us an update on your battle for freedom of speech by the professionally, perpetually offended brigade.
Yeah, I'm actually more worried about this than I thought I would be, to be honest, Dave, because I'm a little bit battle hardened and have been involved in some fights over the years. But next Thursday, I have to, against my will, because of government compulsion, attend a conciliation session at the Queensland Human Rights Commission with 2 drag queens, simply because I said they were inappropriate and dangerous role models for children. And I do maintain they are dangerous role models for children. One of them is a, pornographic star and whose Facebook page is obscene. The other, and whose name is a reference to, homosexual sex. The other is someone who is a woman who's presenting as a man and is crowdfunding to have her breasts cut off. Now these are not, normalising, queer culture in front of impressionable children, I think is inappropriate and wrong, and we should be allowed to say that in civil society. But they've taken offence and have lodged a complaint under the Anti-Discrimination Act. And I don't want to go and spend my day in conciliation with two drag queens, but I have no choice. I have to take time off work to go and do that. And I won't be apologising. I won't be conciliating. I'll be saying that I respect these people as human beings like I am. And but I disagree with them on lifestyle. I disagree with them on what they think is appropriate public policy. And on that basis, I won't be conceding anything. Now, if they decide to go further with this, my lawyers advise me that the next stage is the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal. That's going to cost between $60,000 and $100,000. Now, I don't have that sort of money. So, this is quite a distressing process. Now, thankfully, I think, by people's graciousness, there may be crowdfunding available. That's yet to be tested. No doubt. That there was for Israel Folau, and I'm not Israel Folau. But this is, just crazy that we're in a situation. I never expected, growing up in Australia, that one day in my early 50s, my freedom of speech on something as basic as trying to uphold, the dignity, the rights of children not to be exposed to harmful role models, and discussing that would cause
Let's have a look at this website featuring Diamond Goodrim. It is 9:30 at night, although this can be played at any time. Just bring up that website, Adam. So this is the X Awards, which is the awards from the adult entertainment industry. This is the Porn Star Awards. So if you do porn, if you run brothels, escort services, things like that, you can enter these awards. One of the categories is drag queen. This is what the Brisbane City Council thinks is okay entertainment in a public library, a council premises.
Well, Dave, that image is actually pretty moderate. I mean, I posted on my blog the one that they've taken me to the commission over.
I'm actually not worried about the image, Lyle. It's the category. There's this whole notion that drag queens are no different from clowns, like you'd take the family to see at the circus. And that's just a lie from the pit of hell, because look at this. The adult entertainment industry is calling drag queens peers and colleagues.
Yeah, well, obviously Brisbane City Council hasn't heard of the hashtag Me Too movement and Harvey Weinstein and the like, and yet it thinks this sort of thing is appropriate, or these sort of role models are appropriate. It's beyond
dispute by a right-thinking person that an adult entertainer, and let's just call it for what it is, these are porn actors, that this it's ridiculous. It's pure child grooming. Of course, it's a completely inappropriate role model for children. Completely dangerous to be exposing your kids to this at that age. If you want to do that in the privacy of your own home, that's your business. But on public property, you don't get to do that. You don't get to exclude other people from the library while you use it, and you don't get to expose the other people coming in to that kind of grossly inappropriate sexualization. And let's also take into account the fact that this is essentially the gendered equivalent of blackface, exaggerated, grotesque characterization of people, which is essentially dishonoring both race in the case of blackface, and the femininity and uniqueness of women in the case of drag queens. It's excessive and too much.
These laws that I'm being dragged before the commission are the state equivalent of Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. These are anti-free speech laws. They've seldom been used, but in this environment of offence taking, this is legal architecture set up by the left to try and silence people, and I think we need serious law reform. I don't like going through this process, and I feel uncertain about the future, and I hope that we can see law reform so that no other Australian ever has to be dragged through a legal process like this again for participating in public interest discussion.
Lyle, one of my great frustrations is we have a Conservative government who will not speak out about cultural and social issues. It's great that the Conservatives are good money managers, but what's the point of having good money management if your country is disappearing before your eyes?
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask Andrew, why do we have a Conservative government led by a self-proclaimed Christian Prime Minister? We're still waiting for the bill on religious protection. The government is doing nothing to speak out about issues like that which Lyle is facing. What's the point of a Conservative government when they seem to do nothing to conserve basic human rights such as freedom of speech?
It gets worse, James. The Brisbane City Council is controlled by the LNP and the mayor is a church-going Christian.
So in answer to that question, gentlemen, I've worked very closely with the AG last year in developing these laws, and we had obviously the objections you expect from the Greens and Labor, but what the government wants to do is to deliver a bill that's likely to pass the Senate. And at this stage, we can't craft one that we think will get crossbench support and be successful. And the PM isn't going to, I believe, push through these laws until he can see a likely path forward. At the moment, we don't have the crossbenchers support for it. And that means we have to keep going back and tinkering with it until we do.
What about publicly advocating for freedom, Andrew? And this is the problem, and you're quite generously coming to my book launch tomorrow, but, a big reason why I wrote the book was frustration out of seeing Conservative politicians not doing what the left do every day, and that's get up and argue for their case in the public square. So, we'll hear all the time, oh, well, we can't get support, on the crossbench of the Senate, therefore, we're shelving this. Well, that's not how the left work. They actually get up there and fight and convince. And over 20 or 30 years, the Greens' crazy ideas have become mainstream because they fought for them. Our people don't fight. In fact, our people voted against freedom of speech and freedom of religion amendments when the same-sex marriage bill passed in the wake of the plebiscite. The James Patterson, David Fawcett amendments, which would have done what your religious discrimination bill is trying to do, were voted down by members of the Liberal Party who teamed up with the Greens and with Labor to vote down the very things that Christian Porter is now trying to do. That's one of the things that, just
frustrating.
Caused me it's what caused me to leave Australian Christian Lobby and come back to Queensland and seek to get back involved, re-engaged in mainstream politics, not as a lobbyist, because watching, cabinet, the majority of the Turnbull cabinet and a number of backbenchers vote with the Greens and with Labor against freedom of speech and freedom of religion, whilst people waved rainbow flags in the public gallery of the Parliament and cheered when those things were voted down under a Conservative government, broke my heart.
If I can
I remember that debate well, and each of
I think you voted against the amendment, Andrew. I'm sorry to say.
No, I recall that there was about 4 or 5 of them, and I think I supported half and voted against half. So I was somewhere in the middle, but they were a bit cobbled together and pushed.
No, they weren't actually. They were put together by a very considered legal opinion as part of the No campaign.
But they were enveloped by the.
They were not cobbled together.
They were just. I don't
James Patterson and David Fawcett didn't cobble them together.
No, you're correct. But the cobbling was in the party room, so I don't think most of the MPs on either side had actually read a lot of those. So the move to push them through was really a last-minute pious move to run through the exercise without any serious likelihood of them being successful.
Well, you had John Howard and John Anderson begging. You had John Howard and John Anderson begging the Liberal Party and the national parties to protect freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and that was ignored as that legislation was passed. And here we are 2.5 years down the track without protections, without a Commonwealth override of state-based anti-discrimination legislation. And people like me are winding up in front of kangaroo courts because the rainbow political activists are emboldened.
Let's wrap it up. We've had a long show tonight. We're just on 100 minutes, which is fun. Scored a century. We will run around the screen and give everybody a final comment, and then I'll come back and say goodbye to everyone. So, Karina, what are your thoughts?
I'm still reflecting on what Lyle's going through.
There is
at
a lot.
the moment. It's
we could go for a long time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sure. But Legal Needs Survey found that people going through any kind of court action, litigation, tribunal action, that it does have a significant toll on people, and particularly when it's protracted. And as you've indicated, you're going to fight on, so it's not going to settle, it's going to keep going on. That has a massive toll beyond the financial cost as well on an individual, and no doubt that's what the activists are looking to achieve, actually, to break a person, and also to send a warning shot across the bow that if anyone does dare cross them, if anyone does dare speak out, then this is what you too will face. And I made the point in my last weekly wrap up that there are 10 of us contributors on the Good Source. 3 of us have had either defamation or discrimination action taken against us. It's almost like James, we're waiting, and Dave, brace ourselves. My husband said, "Oh, Karina, be careful what you say," and I said, "No, it doesn't matter what you say.
That's
like
true.
Lyle, what you've said, there's nothing wrong. You're speaking, common sense truth, and yet you are, having action taken against you. So,
yep.
Lyle,
people are asking how they can support you, etc. And absolutely, if it comes to the point where we need to fundraise for you, we'll either do it here or you'll hear about it here and know where to go. I dare say Australian Christian Lobby is probably the best place to do it if they're willing. We'll scream it from the rooftops, because there's no way that should come out of your pocket. Freedom is something we should all chip in for, and we need test cases. We need people who will go to the line and test bad laws until they're overturned and eradicated, because bad laws do exist. Laws once existed to, say black people were the property of white people. Laws still exist that say there's no human rights until you pass the magic birth canal. And there are crazy bad laws which are abused throughout the human rights tribunals and kangaroo courts in Australia. You'll definitely have our full support for whatever it's worth behind you, because we're all in this. You're the ones losing sleep, but we all have a lot to lose if you lose. Your final thoughts?
No, thanks, Dave, and thanks, Karina, and Andrew. I'm sorry if I'm beating up on you a bit tonight. I guess that there's just a lot of frustration from people like me that we need, while we've got an LNP government, and we're not going to have an LNP government forever. We need our side of politics to fight for us, because this is real, and if they get me, they're going to get other people. They've already gone after Christian schools and their freedom to have teachers who believe what the parents believe about marriage. So I tell my kids, prepare for persecution. It's not like it was when your grandparents and when your parents were alive. And, if this is what's happening while there's still a bit of green sap in the tree, what's going to happen when the wood is dry?
Fair point. James, your thought?
If our conservative politicians fought half as hard for freedom of speech as the Greens do for the right to abort a baby or for 2 men to redefine marriage, we wouldn't have a problem. It's incredibly frustrating when the political class express sympathy, but leave people like Lyle feeling like no one's really running the ball up for him, except for a few fringe voices who are quickly dismissed by the media. I personally would always vote Liberal, but the Liberal Party will lose people like me who become frustrated that there's not that fight that Lyle was talking about earlier. And so I agree with what's just been expressed. We're at a time where we've got a Conservative government, but what's the point of a Conservative government if it simply plays safe for 2 terms and then hands over power again? We elect a Conservative government to do things and not just manage the economy, but to safeguard the basic freedoms that allow us to live our lives in the greatest country on earth.
Lamo, it's been great having you with us tonight. You do have a thick skin, and I do like somebody who is on my side who I can disagree with and trust to give me an intellectual argument. What are your final thoughts for this evening on anything we've discussed?
Had a pretty good run, David. So just to say thanks, great being with everyone tonight. I'll be Lyle's biggest book buyer tomorrow night. I'll be putting a copy of his book into every high school in the city. And on COVID, it's not a once-in-a-century event. It's not a once-in-a-decade event. Australia, like all countries, has to be used to pandemics now every few years. And that means we have to really rethink the way we approach these challenges, both economically and public health. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. And thank you to the panel for joining this evening. The conversation's been good and long. I hope nobody minded. I apologise if you did. We've still got nearly 100 people watching across both channels still, so that's fantastic. Again, just to mention, to head to goodsource.news if you would like to get our email updates, or if you'd like to become a supporter and contribute. We do have a private Facebook group. I'll soon be trying to find a way to put that on the website so people who aren't on Facebook can also access the recordings that we do behind the scenes, giving you access to the interviews before and after the bit that makes the publication the next day. So that's a lot of fun for supporters, and sometimes you get privy to some. We had a conversation this week we actually had to delete from the group because it was just a little bit too honest and real. And so you would get to see that if you were a supporter. However, that's awesome. Look, my final thought for tonight is, why don't we have the Brisbane Lord Mayor, a LNP Conservative? Why don't we have the Prime Minister, a allegedly Conservative, coming out and doing a press conference and doing a doorstop and saying, this is atrocious what's happening to Lyle Shelton. There's no way what he said would in any reasonable sphere be considered controversial. It's very, very straightforward. Drag queens are not suitable role models for children, and they should not be considered entertainment promoted by the council in public property. I don't know why it's really hard for a Conservative politician to come out and take a stand for what's right and true and justice. They absolutely should be on the record and influencing public opinion in the media. Maybe they need to hear from you to encourage them to do something that approximates a spine, because they need negative feedback as well as positive feedback to help them incentivize important career decisions. Well, that's it for Pellowe Talk Live tonight. It's been fantastic chatting with you, seeing your comments, getting interactions. Don't forget to share all of this, and we'll see you in the comments section. But until then, have a good night.
Good night.